Man pulled a weak canine dog from a deadly mud pit. Then the stunning truth came out. Rain stitched the Montana pines into a gray curtain as Elias Turner cut along the game trail, counting breaths like a metronome to keep his footing in the slurry. The forest sounded wrong, no birds, just the hiss of runoff and a faint clipped tone that did not belong to trees or wind. Then a noise threaded the hush, not a bark, not a wolf's cry, a broken, deliberate whine spaced like someone tapping out a code. He moved toward it, boots sinking, axe balanced in one hand, eyes reading the ground the way he once read smoke. The pit appeared between firs like an open wound, a churned basin where the storm had chewed the hillside. Bubbles rose through the brown surface and popped with slow sighing. In the center, a massive canine shape fought the drag of the muck, chest deep, coated in slick clay that turned fur to armor. It lifted its head, those eyes fixed on him, steady, calculating, not feral. Around its neck, under the mud, a hard edge flashed when lightning crawled behind the clouds. Not a collar tag exactly, something matte, angular, stamped with tiny grid marks. The dog shifted and the whine came again, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, a pattern that made Elias's skin prickle because it felt intentional. He scanned the rim, no safe footing, no fallen trunk long enough to span the mire. But along the lip he found prints, boot treads larger than his own, circling once, stopping at the steepest point, then vanishing where there should have been a retreat. The canine's forelegs surfaced and he saw under the sludge a braided cord looped tight like someone had tied it for hauling and then cut it free. Elias tasted iron in the rain and felt an old firehouse reflex lock into place. He could walk away. He did, and the moment he reached in he saw the first detail that proved this was no ordinary dog, something that once revealed would overturn every rule he trusted. Elias Turner kept his cabin plain on purpose. A weathered pine box at the timber's edge with a narrow stove, a cot, tool hooks, and maps pinned above a desk he'd built from salvaged boards. Every nail counted, every knot sanded until it stopped catching his sleeve. Nothing ornamental survived his habit of culling because anything without a use gathered dust, and dust collected memories he preferred to stack in neat, labeled rows. Boots dried upside down near the fire on a rack he welded from rebar. A steel thermos leaned by the sink, dents pressed into its skin like thumbprints. 3 coils of rope hung on pegs by size, each checked for abrasion, each retied until the bends lay clean. The axe lived in a leather sling that he oiled every first Saturday. The place smelled like stove smoke, wet wool, and cedar soap shaved into a jar. He woke before dawn by muscle memory, no alarm, no radio, the same way he used to wake to sirens and shouted names in long halls, thick with heat. Push-ups came first, slow, mechanical, shoulders opening, breath steady, counting without counting, then a series of stretches until scar tissue released its grip on his ribs and spine. Coffee followed in a black enamel mug while he noted barometer fall, wind veer, cloud ceiling, and precipitation chance. Every detail logged in a pocket notebook, stubbornly tidy despite rain stains along the edges. Breakfast stayed small, oats with a pinch of salt, jerky torn into strips, and an apple if he remembered to buy one the last time he went into town. He ran a short drill with a sandbag, farmer's carries around the clearing, a plank, held until his elbows trembled, because the body only gives what it rehearses. The past had written itself across him in raised lines and quiet aches. Fire carved a scar where a stairwell folded, pinning him while a partner levered iron through flame and pulled him into air sharp enough to burn. War added tinnitus, a permanent hush that sat under every other sound, plus a clutch of images he kept in a locked drawer behind his eyes, a door buckling inward, grit in teeth, somebody laughing too loudly because they were still alive, somebody not laughing because they weren't. He filed these things the way he filed tools, by weight, by risk, by lesson. They decided what he fixed, what he ignored, what he stepped toward when other people stepped back. Routine steadied him. He liked small chores performed in the same order, not from superstition but from respect for consequences. Saturday came saturated, sky rolled low and colorless, rain falling in a slant that turned the clearing to black glass. Roof seams ticked, gutters rattled. He layered waxed canvas over flannel, cinched a hood, then laced boots scarred by shale and thaw cycles. The axe went to his right shoulder, 30 feet of kernmantle rope clipped to his pack with a locking carabiner he'd marked in red paint, because he trusted marked things. Tape, a knife, and a compact tourniquet rode in a small pouch, not out of fear, just acknowledgement that the woods always negotiated in good faith until they did. He planned a short run for wood, nothing dramatic, only windfall he could buck into manageable lengths, and drag to the truck before the draw swelled. The trees drank and dripped as if the sky had set a faucet to slow. Needles hissed, leaves whispered. Runnels stitched the path, pooled where elk hooves had pressed soft ground earlier in the week, then spilled downhill brown, quick, impulsive. He moved the way he once moved through smoke, weight centered, knees loose, eyes placing the next 4 steps while ears floated free to gather information. His eyes might miss. The forest smelled like wet iron and crushed fir tips. Breath made small fogs that crumpled against the hood. He kept the axe low when branches narrowed, used the handle to test mud for that treacherous slick that meant clay near the surface, shifted left when he saw it, shifted back when a patch accepted one heel, and then tried to keep it. He didn't carry music because he liked to hear what the place said. He counted without counting and let his mind step quietly. The town lay 15 miles and 1 mountain over, close enough for groceries, far enough that strangers rarely drifted past, unless they'd lost a trail or found a bottle. He had neighbors, kind enough, capable, each content to wave and be done, which suited him. He had an old friend in the valley who sometimes called about a broken gate or a water pump that refused to prime, a ranger who traded him balm for rope splices, and a handful of names in a phone he rarely powered on. Everything else he needed either grew, fell, or could be made. By mid-morning the grove ahead looked darker where the canopy thickened, a natural roof that kept the worst of the rain from knifing down. He skirted a fresh slide where the hillside had shrugged, soil skidding across shattered ferns. The air tightened to the reach of a trout. He paused on a granite knob and watched water sheet over a reclined log, reading currents the way he once read stairwells. Something felt off, not a threat exactly, more like a chord out of tune. He let his breath taper instead of chopping. Then he heard it, so faint he thought it might be the tinnitus smudging the edge of sound, a thin unnatural whine pulled flat by distance and weather. It came again, clipping the hiss of rain, not wind through a split limb, not a hawk under cover. The tone held a plea and a peculiar deliberateness that made his shoulders tighten, because effort lived inside it. He turned his head without moving his feet, triangulating by echo and slope. Downslope, beyond a line of hemlock where water disappeared, the note repeated weaker, as if the throat that made it had been working too long. Instinct rose clean, the same unarguable lift that had carried him toward banging pipes behind hot drywall, toward voices trapped in stairwells full of smoke, toward doors that did not want to open. He told his hands to slow down, because they always tried to reach too soon. He slid the axe from its sling and used the haft to test depth, as he sidestepped toward the channel. Boots settled to the ankle and popped free like suction cups. He kept his weight stacked, shoulders square, hips quiet. Every few steps, he stopped and let the forest recalibrate around him. The whine dwindled to a thread, then scratched back with a rasp that sounded like sand across a tin lid. He pictured an animal snagged in wire, a fawn stumbled into a pool, a hound trapped where earth had liquefied. All the ordinary disasters rain-stitched into wild country. The ground told him caution mattered more than speed. He listened. The sound placed itself inside a basin where a wallow had turned to slurry, a raw cut across the slope, edges sloughing, surface broken by slow, obscene bubble. He felt the basin's pull in his calves, a tremor that warned against bravado and promised embarrassment at least, a burial at worst. He circled high, eyes measuring spans a rope might bridge and trunks that might hold under load. 2 candidates flexed when he leaned on them, so he rejected both and tapped a third with the axe handle, until the bark rang solid. Before he leaned in earnest, the call rose one more time, nearer now, threaded with exhaustion and an odd steadiness that did not belong to panic. He gave the rope a small tug, an old signal he had used inside smoke to say someone was there, even when he couldn't see his own hands. Silence answered, then a scrape, as if effort had been spent on acknowledgement alone. He edged closer, staying above the worst of the mire, rain blurring his lashes, heart even, hands calm, senses widened until the landscape turned into a grid of angles, forces and margins thin as paper. Whatever waited below had made that sound, And whatever made that sound had pulled him here without permission. He did not know why yet, he only knew he was going to find it, because men like him kept moving when the world asked a hard question, and the first step toward any answer was listen. Rain thinned to a steady whisper as Elias edged around the basin and stared into a churn of brown that moved like a slow breath. Storm water had eaten the bank and left a crater where clay and silt rotated in collapsing rings. The smell carried minerals and sour rot, earth newly chewed and stirred. In the middle, something immense lifted, sank and lifted again, a rhythm held together by stubborn will more than strength. Then the shape clarified through veils of rain, a gigantic canine, chest buried, shoulders flattened by wet weight, hide turned to a ragged coat of ropes, ribs printed under the matted fur. The head turned and found him. Eyes, dark and lucid, stared through rain with a steadiness that did not belong to panic. Breath sawed out in rough strokes, the exhale quivered as if the body had been spending every last coin it owned. Elias counted distances the way he once measured heat, anchor to anchor, span to bridge, slope to betray, margins that forgave nothing. The first band of shore looked serviceable. Beyond that, the lip turned slick where clay showed through. A sheen like oiled glass, grass leaned downhill, combed by sheet flow. He pictured the animal stepping onto a crust failing, body pitching forward, forelegs punching in, chest sealing to suction. Every motion since has bought inches in debt. The forepaws paddled without traction. Each kick traded a brief rise for a heavier sink. A hoarse whine climbed and failed. It came again, thinner like a note rubbed flat by use. Elias felt his forearms prickle despite the weather in the cloth. He had heard that sound in stairwells when air ran out and people rationed noise to conserve breath. He crouched and swept the perimeter for tools. Alder leaned over emptiness like a bad idea promising reach. Two hemlocks stood back from the lip, their roots braided into the hill, trunks solid enough to trust with a line. He searched for fallen limbs and found a branch thick as a wrist, punky at the core but stiff enough for probing. Knees flexed. He slid forward until mud puckered under his soles, then eased the branch toward the animal. Rain stitched between furs and struck the pit, dimpled, rippled, vanished. The dog watched the branch with the slow attention of something at the border between effort and surrender. Teeth showed, not bared, just there, dulled by grit. The jaw opened. The tongue pressed against the branch's tip, failed to hold, slipped away. The head sagged, then lifted again by memory rather than energy. Elias drew the branch back and thumped its butt against the bank to knock off mud. He scanned the trees again. The alder would shear. The hemlocks would carry the pull if he set the angle clean and avoided cutting the lip with the line. He ran the plan in place, a calm rehearsal secure to the farther trunk. Redirect through the nearer. Cast a loop to seat behind the shoulders. Take up slack, pull with regular cadence. He wanted a harness and a second set of hands. He had rope, a carabiner and a willingness to be enough. The rain steepened, softened, then settled into a metronome that erased the idea of minutes. Water threaded his hood and ran down his neck, cold as coin. The dog's breathing shortened, bellows leaking at every seam. Paws kept making swimming motions against a floor that did not care. He tried a voice made for smoke and closed spaces, the kind you cast like a line for someone to grab. "Easy," he said, not coaxing, not commanding, only giving cadence. One ear twitched, eyes stayed on him, steady, almost clinical. That steadiness unsettled him, and steadied him in the same instant. He slid the branch farther, nudged the chest, bumped a shoulder, kept contact light. Response came late, but clear. A twitch that meant sensation still traveled from touch to brain. Another push drew a lift, half an inch. Then a drop. The animal reset with visible shaking. It was losing height inch by inch. When the head went under, the argument would be finished. Hesitation moved through him like a pressure change before a squall. He pictured the foot that slips, the mud swallowing to the thigh, the rope carving downward, the tree giving, the basin deciding. Two lives made a neater story than one. He let those reels play once so they wouldn't ambush him mid-pull. Then the second habit, older than fear, took the field. A quiet calculus of danger versus duty that had sent him up smoking stairwells and through doors that bucked instead of opened. He adjusted the scenario. If he kept his center low, used the redirect and built tension gradually, the slide risk fell inside acceptable lines. He could not guarantee survival for both of them, but he could improve the odds by refusing panic and following the sequence. He checked the slope again and picked his exact places for knees, heels and hands. A raven made a dry knock somewhere uphill. A carpenter testing joists. The rain shifted from needles to threads. Clouds pressed lower. The treeline hunched like a shoulder against the cold. The smell of clay intensified with that metallic hint groundwater brings when it breathes. He touched the mud with 2 fingers. Cold worked through his glove in a blink. The surface surrendered immediately and tried to keep him when he withdrew. He rocked back on his heels and breathed once, slow, to settle the machinery in his chest. The dog's head drooped until the chin almost brushed slurry. Eyes stayed on Elias, reflecting gray sky and a thin ring of fur. He saw exhaustion there, but also a curious stillness, as if something in that skull had registered the math of effort and decided the stranger on the rim mattered. He lifted the branch one last time, and offered it crosswise, steady, close. The mouth opened, closed, opened again. The tongue made a shy curl that would have worked if there had been even a thumb's worth of strength left. It failed and rested on the wood, a gesture so humble it ached. The eyes flicked shut, opened, and pinned him again. Elias set the branch aside. He pressed his palm to the nearest hemlock, feeling the live stiffness under wet bark. He pictured knots, a figure 8 on a bite, a quick loop backed with a stopper, the choreography his hands knew without consent. Before he left to rig, he let his face hold the animal's gaze the way one partner holds another's right. Before the split at a landing, that ordinary solemn contract of I have you, you have me. We go. The eyes answered with quiet comprehension that felt like consent. If you've ever stood on a rim and known the next step could cost more than you meant to spend, you know the particular quiet that arrives. Not drama, not glory, just the sober click of decision locking into place. Think back to the time you saw trouble that didn't have your name on it and chose to make it yours anyway. Hold that moment for a breath. That is where Elias stood now. Rain in his collar, mud tugging his boots. A lifetime of drills compressing into a single move. He turned from the pit and started toward the hemlock to stage the rope. The world narrowing to sequence and grip and angle. Behind him, the dog exhaled a faint hitching note, as if surrender had paused to watch whether the stranger who listened would also act. He quickened his pace, jaw set, purpose burning steady. Rain thickened as Elias cut uphill toward the truck, moving quickly without waste, counting breath, picking footholds so the slope wouldn't take him before he could help. Gravel clicked under his soles when he reached the turnout. He dropped the tailgate, pulled an orange coil from a milk crate, checked sheath and core with cold fingers, and clipped a locking carabiner to the bitter end. A second coil went across his shoulder for backup. He shut the gate, trotted back through wet grass and traced his earlier line along the ridge, keeping height until the pit opened like a wound below him again. Rain ran from branch tips in silver chains. Wind worried the firs with a low, steady voice. The lip bled water, clay shone like glass. He chose the farther hemlock for the main anchor, wrapped the trunk waist-high, tied a figure 8 on a bite, backed it with a stopper, then ran the line through a carabiner on a nearer trunk to build a clean redirect and spare the rim. Coils spilled from his hand in mud-slick loops. Rain sheeted off the hood and braided across his face. He brushed it away with the back of a glove and leaned to sight the throw. The dog floated low, eyes fixed on him with a steadiness that made the moment feel strangely formal, as if both had signed an invisible paper. "Hold," he said, putting cadence in the space between them. He tied a bowline at the free end, shaped a wide loop to seat behind shoulders and ribs, and cast. The first throw smacked the slurry and crawled toward the sink. He hauled it back, shook clay from the strands, reset his feet and threw again. The loop landed beyond the forelegs, then drifted sideways. He worked it with small pulls, coaxing the rope across a ridge of fur until it lay where it might catch. The animal tried to lift, failed, tried again, mouth opening on a dry click. The effort said everything, strength almost gone, willingness still present. "Easy," he murmured, talking as much to his hands as to the creature. He took up slack until the line buzzed like a tuning fork. The redirect kept the angle safe and his boots away from the treacherous lip. He braced against the roots, lowered his hips, straightened back and arms in one coordinated lean. Rope moved with a hiss through wet glove. The first haul bought nearly nothing, just an alteration in the slurry's pattern that said suction had noticed the challenge. Muscle woke with a sting. Scar tissue tugged. The rib he'd cracked years ago lit with a dull throb. He reset his stance, leaned again, and then again, building a cadence that mimicked hose work on stairs. All those years collapsed into this single stubborn physics problem. The dog's paws churned water that wasn't there. Foam gathered at the mouth, washed clean, returned. He let the line slide an inch, gathered it again, hunting that quiet hinge where vacuum begins to bargain, and then let go. Boots slipped. He chopped his feet, carving purchase in the slick. Breath shortened, grew measured, took on the count he used for stubborn doors and failing lungs. The next pull yielded inches. The loop bit deeper against the chest. The head rose, sank, rose again. The line's pulse traveled up his arms like a second heartbeat. Shoulders trembled, water blurred his sight. He blinked hard, not against fear, only the wet weight. He watched his vector, guarding against a cut into the rim that would trap the rope and ruin the day. A step left softened the curve. He gathered slack and leaned. The anchor groaned, then held. The line thrummed under strain, pure and honest. Mud fought back methodically, a union of weight, glue and vacuum. Elias changed rhythm. 3 short draws, 1 long lean, reset breath, repeat. Heat built inside the gloves, though the air stayed knife cold. Forearms burned, thighs shivered. He felt a thin gravel layer slide under the skin of clay and used it, stamping ridges until friction answered. The loop tried to slip forward toward the throat. He twitched his wrists, lifted and settled it behind the shoulder blade again, buying leverage molecule by molecule. Rain drummed on his hood, filled his ears and ran down his neck with a cold, steady insistence that wanted to distract and failed. Bite if you can, he called, flicking a short tail toward the mouth. The jaws opened, closed, opened again, teeth touching rope, sliding off. Even that failed effort helped. The head lifted an extra inch. The back bowed. The trapped body began to partner with the pull. Elias took the hint, set his hips low, and hauled. The rope burned. Breath shortened into tight ration. The pit belched a bubble, released a slurp of sour air, and surrendered another inch. His right boot shot sideways and nearly through him. Only the way he kept his hips stacked saved him. He absorbed the slide, bent his knees, let the line keep tension, and scrambled until his soles found a root with bite. Clay smeared every surface. Rain thickened into a gray screen that turned distance to fog and sound to static. He tasted grit and the ghost of old smoke that lived in memory, whether he invited it or not. He closed his teeth on a grunt and leaned again. The chest lifted higher. A sucking pop sounded obscene yet hopeful. The animal shifted toward him 2 inches, then through. Elias walked backward step by careful step, feeding his weight into the system without jerking. He imagined crew voices at his shoulder, the comfort of shared strain. He had the trees, the line, and a living thing refusing to give up. It would be He pulled until a tremor ran from rope to spine. The loop climbed the shoulder and found a notch. Mud peeled from fur in thick sheets. Legs surfaced, trembling, then vanished as the basin tugged. He edged left to improve the angle, hauled and listened to the hemlock complain. He whispered an apology to Bark, set his jaw and continued. Because the equation was clean, either he stopped or the animal did. The body lurched forward a foot. The rim sloughed, sending a brown wave toward the center. He felt the surge in his hands and used it, taking 2 quick draws before the basin sucked back. A clod rolled under his heel and flipped him onto his side. Reflex twisted him, one hand locked on the rope, the other snatching a low branch to stop a full sprawl. His shoulder detonated with pain. Sparks flashed behind his eyes. He breathed once through clenched teeth, found his knees, recovered tension before slack ate the gain. The dog made a sound that wasn't a cry or snarl, more a strangled growl aimed at the mud. Elias answered with a hoarse, "With me," not an order, a promise. The big body slid another foot. Forelegs found a smear of firmness and pushed. Suction let go with a clap. The rope jerked hard enough to blister skin even through gloves. Elias bore down, became a lever and committed everything left in his back. The world narrowed to 3 points. The hemlock's heartwood, the line cutting water, the creature's will. The final bind broke like a rotten nail, giving way inside a beam. Weight surged. He eased the rope free, knelt beside the dog and exhaled, astonished by its immense silence tonight. Rain slackened to a thready mist as the great dog lay where Elias had pulled it free, ribs shuddering under a mud-plastered coat, while breath scraped in harsh, shallow runs that fogged the cooling air. He stayed a measured distance at first, palms open, axe sheathed, rope coiled beside his boot, the old discipline settling into his bones like a familiar weight. Instinct warned that teeth and terror could still flash without signal after a struggle like that, yet nothing in the animal's posture promised violence. It simply existed on the edge of collapse, head low, eyes steady, tracking him with a focus that felt almost formal. Rain clicked from needles, slowed, and then paused as the cloud deck thinned to pale gauze. The forest held its breath. Elias listened with the care he once reserved for rooms about to flash over, hearing only the quiet metronome of panting, the soft tick of cooling rope hardware, and the distant thread of water sliding over shale. He knelt, not close, just enough that they shared a line of sight without threat, and let his hands rest on his thighs, shoulders eased, chest open, making himself small in every way that mattered. The gaze he met was not wide, it was present, lucid, older than fear, carrying a question he could not parse but could honor. Recognition or something neighboring it moved through him with a heat that surprised him, like finding a live ember under ash hours after the last flame. 2 wars and a lifetime of fires had taught him that living things under pressure read bodies better than words, so he kept the scene simple: stillness, breath, and patience. The dog blinked once, not a flinch, more a slow shudder, then let its jaw settle on clay and closed its mouth around a sound that might have been pain or relief. Steam rose from its hide in faint strands, a tremor traveled along the flank. Then Elias glanced at the sky, judged the window before the weather regrouped, and made a choice that felt less like a decision than an acknowledgement of a road he had stepped onto the moment he tied the first knot. He shrugged off his pack, set it on a dry fern mat, and took out a small steel bottle, a folded tarp, tinder, a striker and a waxed pouch that lived there for moments without guarantee. He unfolded the tarp, shook rain from creases, and spread it near a dent in the ground where runoff had failed to settle. The act invited the dog to move without demanding it. Nothing shifted, only the eyes followed, measuring each motion with dignified concentration. He poured water into a shallow lid, slid it a handspan closer and waited. The tongue appeared, pink under stained foam, barely lifting, then retreated as if the body refused to trust its own reach. Elias nudged the lid another inch and backed away again until space felt breathable for both of them. Time went soft around the edges. An alder leaf drifted down, touched the dog's shoulder and clung there like a medal until a slow breath lifted it free. Elias remembered a night in a city far from pines when he and a partner crawled under a beam while floors above them, argued about staying upright, how he had spoken to a stranger trapped under an iron bed, kept his tone level, described the next minutes as if reading from a manual written by Mercy, how the stranger's eyes, ringed by soot, had locked onto his and held, not pleading, not raging, just insisting that witness mattered. That same insistence lived here now, transposed to a torn, exhausted creature on damp soil, and he felt it like a thread running through the years, binding unalike moments into a single vow. He struck the rod, caught a spark on the fiber, breathed until the ember became flame, then stacked pencilwood, then fingerwood, building heat without smoke so the air stayed kind. The smell of resin and damp bark turned the clearing from clinic to heart. With the fire working, he tore a heel of bread into thumb pieces, set them on the tarp, then shaved a strip of jerky into narrow curls that would not choke a tired throat. He spoke no command, offered no kiss or whistle, only quiet breath and The dog lifted its head a fraction, eyes narrowing as if that flame lived inside memory, muscles along the jaw flexed, a paw twitched. Elias waited. When nothing more came, he pushed one bread piece along the tarp with 2 fingers until it sat midway between. Minutes passed, not empty, simply full of attention. At last, the animal extended its tongue, touched the bread, drew it back, then tried again, this time catching the softened crumb and holding it against the palate long enough to swallow. Elias felt a flood of something that was not triumph and not pity, only relief stitched to respect. He guided water closer with the back of a knuckle until the lid bumped the chin. The tongue found the rim and drank in tiny, hesitant licks that became steadier with each pat. After several sips, the head lowered and rested again. Rain thinned to freckles, then stopped entirely, leaving light suspended between trunks. Pale, clean, new, the fire whispered. Ravens passed as shadows above the canopy, uninterested judge. Elias warmed his hands and let heat crawl up into wrists and forearms where cold had set anchor during the pull. The dog watched the hands rather than the flame, studying the slow opening and closing as if cataloging each joint. Something in that focus unsettled him, not in a way that warned, but in a way that suggested language. He set another bread piece down, then a sliver of jerky. The meat drew attention, a nostril flared, the head moved an inch, the tongue gathered the offering with care, held, swallowed, rested. Elias measured the breath now, still rough, less desperate, pacing itself. He felt the way a stalled heart sometimes remembers its duty when given oxygen and time. His own chest, long used to the harness of effort, loose. The rope, rinsed by rain, glowed faintly where light reached it. He coiled it by habit because order nested inside care. Steam ebbed from the coat, clots of mud cracked and fell away, revealing coarse guard hairs the color of winter rivers. Scars crossed the shoulder in pale lines under the grime, some old, some recent. A broken claw showed on the left forefoot. The sheer scale astonished him. Next to the firelight, the head looked almost wolfen, yet the eyes held none of a wolf's glassy indifference. They held an appraisal. He realized he had been waiting for a snap, a warning, a reversion to a rule he understood, because behavior that fit a box could be managed. Instead he found a presence that met him halfway, and asked him to step farther. That ask tugged at places he had sealed. Memory opened anyway. If a moment like this has ever found you, remember the hush, the choice to stay, and the warmth you offered without asking anything back. The mist returned in a fine veil that silvered every needle and deepened the scent of crushed fur as the dog lifted its head and watched Elias through the wavering heat of his small fire. Earlier, in his notebook, he had written a name for it without ceremony: Shadow, because the body moved like weather against bark and because the word refused argument once it arrived. Shadow sounded again, not a bark, not a growl, but a set of low pulses shaped in careful parcels. One, a pause; two, another pause; three, held together like beads. Elias was not a man who fed superstition. The work that built his habits had punished romance and rewarded arithmetic. Hose pressure, collapse angles, ventilation, timing, triage, the exact placement of a foot on a blackened stair. Yet he had also learned to trust signals that arrive before language, the way a warm door speaks through skin and the way a hallway loads the air a heartbeat before it flashes. Shadow's pulses felt like that kind of they were not random, not a broken cough of pain, but a pattern with intention behind it, measured, repeated, adjusted toward him each time he shifted his weight. The rain changed pitch along the trees, dripping in narrow curtains and beading the rope coil that lay rinsed and clean beside the tarp. The mud crater glistened beyond the fire, a slack mouth made by storm water. It seemed to listen too. Elias steadied his hands with the small comfort of motion, breaking twigs, feeding the tiny flame, checking knots he had already tied, while the delayed tremor of survival ran its course through muscle and breath. He had heard stories in town, the way one hears the music of a place between errands. Hunters spoke of dusk shapes too tall for wolf and too deliberate for bear. Calves shifted in their pens at midnight to a rhythm no one could name. The ranger, Maggie Holt, kept a drawer of odd plaster casts and photographs beneath folded maps, long strides across logging roads, prints near creeks that suggested weight without leaving depth, saplings bent into glyphs that pointed nowhere and everywhere. He had dismissed such talk as weathered folklore, as human need drawing faces on fog. Now Shadow pulsed a phrase and then added a faint click produced by teeth meeting the rope fiber as if marking a beat. Elias found himself matching the counts with finger taps against his knee before caution stopped him, because the loop he was entering felt like a contract. Gratitude shone in the eyes without softening their clarity. Awareness lived there, neither tame nor human, yet unmistakably present, the kind of presence that meets another mind at a doorway neither owns. He felt wonder touch the stern discipline he used to keep the world in order. the same old treacherous wonder that had once arrived when a black hallway yielded to water and sent steam curling toward a bright rectangle he could barely see. He pressed the heel of his hand against a scarred rib, more to ground himself than to soothe pain, and tried to name what stood before him. A training cue. No handler had stepped out of the dripping timber to claim success. Pathology. Broken patterns do not compose new ones. Coincidence. He had saved too many lives to trust that excuse. He lifted a finger and drew an invisible triangle in the air, then tapped 3 times on a stone, paused and tapped once. Shadow's ears tipped. After a considered silence, the animal returned 1, 2, 3, short rest, 1 followed by a tiny correction, as though accuracy mattered. The response did not feel like mimicry, it felt like an answer. The rain deepened, pressing the clearing inward. Firelight sharpened edges, the loop burns along the rope, the steam wavering from Shadow's hide, the beads of water standing like mercury on cedar needles. Elias remembered a convoy halted on a chalk road, a radio cut mid-sentence, and the way every body in the line listened to a quiet that roared until a distant engine coughed the world back into motion. The body knows when intelligence shares a radius. His body knew it now. He thought of Maggie's casts and the slang names people use when the woods refuse identification. He thought of hunters who refused certain valleys because sound folded there. Shadow sniffed, touched meat with the tip of a careful tongue, and accepted the offering with a pause that felt ceremonial. The eyes never left his face. Rain slackened. The forest listened with them. Elias tested the boundary of the moment by placing a short stick on the tarp and sliding it toward Shadow. The dog laid a paw on the stick, released 2 gentle pulses, and pushed the stick back. Something inside him, held tight through years of duty, loosened exactly 1 notch. Logic did not leave, it simply opened a gate. He said quietly, "Shadow," to learn whether the sound belonged to him alone, and the head tilted not to the name he suspected but to the intent braided through it. In town he had smiled at tales that stitched bear, man and myth together, and called the hybrid by a borrowed word. What watched him now did not ask for that costume, it asked for attention, and attention was the one currency he trusted over legend. Shadow spoke again, building the first phrase into a second with a different pause between the notes. He answered by tapping that pause into the stone, then waited. The answer returned, shifted by a hair, as though the dog were checking whether he had really heard. Elias exhaled. He realized he was not afraid, he was awake. The animal had chosen to stay within reach when it could have dragged itself into the brush and disappeared. That choice carried meaning. Meaning, he thought, is where fear either grows teeth or learns to stand still. He bowed his head, not in worship, not in surrender, only in respect for a boundary he could feel and not yet draw. When he raised it, the eyes held an invitation plain as a blaze mark on old bark. He nodded once, a movement any creature could read. A twig cracked in the timber behind him and then fell silent, as if the woods had paused to witness a compact. He did not turn toward the sound. He stayed with the eyes that stayed with him and let the moment settle like silt after rain. Legends had always pressed against these hills. He had stacked them in the drawer labeled stories and left them there. Shadow had tugged that drawer open with 3 soft pulses and a click on the rope. An hour earlier he would have argued that the forest contains only what it shows. Now he conceded that the forest also contains what it implies and repeats. He did not pretend to know where the line lay between beast and fable. He simply recognized that he had stepped over a line of his own, from seeing an animal to meeting a presence. Wind moved through the high crowns with the hush of a crowd testing its breath. The fire popped and sap found air. Shadow's ears tracked the sound and then returned to him. Elias spoke the simplest truth he owned. All right. The word was not permission, it was acceptance. The rain beaded, hung and fell. The clearing darkened by a shade that carried no threat, only emphasis. He felt the old arithmetic of risk rearrange itself under a new condition. This was no ordinary creature. Whatever lived in those patterns had dimension and intent. He would not say the name people used for other myths. He would say this instead: the woods had introduced him to a neighbor he had never admitted lived here. He banked the fire to coals and tucked the rope beneath the tar. Shadow lowered its head to the edge of the lid, drank and issued a final quiet sequence whose cadence matched the rain. It sounded like thanks, or maybe like a promise to continue. Elias listened until the last note dissolved into dripping branches, and then he set his palm on the ground between them, steady as a stake, and held there, waiting to see whether the world would answer back. 4 nights after the rescue, wind pressed the cabin, and the stove ticked as it cooled. when a heavy step landed on the porch. He eased the latch. Rain sifted under a low moon. Shadow stood at the threshold, huge and whole, coat clean to an iron sheen, breath even, eyes clear. It did not push inside. A tilt toward the trees, a return of gaze, another tilt, an invitation, plain as a gesture. Elias checked the mantle, coaxed flame, and brought the lantern into the weather. "All right," he said to the night and to the beast, and closed the door behind him. Shadow drifted from the porch and took the path with the confidence of something born from rain. Elias followed, boots biting wet ground, the lantern's glow carving a moving room from the dark. Runnels stitched the trail. Ferns breathed against his legs. The old rules returned without ceremony. Keep weight centered. Test before you trust. Never let the hillside think faster than you do. The forest seemed to fold around their small procession, absorbing light and echo. Hemlocks crowded overhead. Needles made fine glass in the lantern beam. Storms had worked the slope all week. Mud held prints and erratic slides. The animal navigated with minimal sound, paws finding firmness that eyes alone might miss. He let that confidence set a cadence he could keep. Rain dwindled to a hiss, then lift fog streamed low across the path, and broke against trunks in ghostly eddies. Breath settled into rationed, steady measures. Lantern light licked bark and rope burns on his knuckles. The cabin fell behind until it was only an idea with warm windows. Fresh marks appeared that did not belong to storms alone. A sapling bent and tucked rather than snapped. A fan of stones arranged across a seep. A shallow circle pressed into mud where something heavy had rested, then lifted with care. Elias did not stop to catalog because stopping feeds doubt and the slope gladly serves it. He kept moving. The draw collected water below them and found its voice. Shadow paused at each turn as if listening to information carried along fibers Elias could not see. Then the animal would continue, unhurried, certain. If you have ever trusted your gut when the safer choice begged louder, remember that temperature in the chest, that clean, thin edge, hold it here. They crossed a narrow run on slick stones bright with algae. Elias tested with the lantern pole, stepped, shifted, nearly lost the third rock, and recovered with a low sound. He felt more than heard. Shadow waited on the far bank, tail still, ears forward, pretense absent. The beast was not hurrying. On the other side the trail climbed through firs so old their roots braided like rope. Lantern arcs swung, cutting modest crescents from the night. An owl dropped a single syllable somewhere and withheld the rest. A branch scratched across his hood like a dry mat. The air smelled of wet cedar and cold stone. Elias remembered stairwells and smoke and the way a partner's silhouette meant survival at turns where visibility died. Shadow's outline carried that same promise translated into fur and seam. At a narrow ledge, the ravine became visible, not by sight so much as by sound. Fine clatter over shale, the music of pieces finding new places to live. Shadow shortened its stride and picked a line only inches wide that somehow felt trustworthy. Elias followed, free hand skimming rock. The lantern held a hair higher, so flame would not starve. He talked inside his head the way he had on long pulls with hose. Hips low, shoulders quiet, step, breathe. Beyond the ledge, the path widened to a shelf where wind gathered and combed the crowns. Clouds shredded. The moon pressed a pale coin through gauze and gave the forest a faint metallic sheen. With more light came more shadow, and with more shadow came that sense of being witnessed by something patient. Shadow halted, lifted its muzzle and sent a low note into the timber. Another answered from far off, similar in shape, deeper in pitch. The exchange felt like a door unlatched. Elias did not reach for the axe. He kept the lantern steady and let the call settle wherever such things settle. After a pause the animal moved again, faster now, not reckless, just decisive. Elias matched that decision, ribs tightening then easing as the new pace wore into habit. Ruts cut by runoff forced detours. Windfalls demanded small climbs. Roots asked for knees soft enough to forgive a misstep. He gave the terrain the courtesy it required, and it returned passage. The world condensed to a working diagram: weight, angle, reach, return. Trust threaded the numbers. He did not fight the arithmetic, he added to it. Time loosened. The hike became a tie. The lantern's glow, the forest's breath, the click of a carabiner against his pack, the faint squeak of wet leather, the quiet punctuation of Shadow's steps. These formed a single sentence that did not stop for punctuation marks. Elias realized he had not asked where they were going because the question would not improve his footing. Whatever was waiting had already chosen to be found. He instructed Fear to carry a small pack and keep up. At last the grade softened. A corridor appeared between two colossal firs, their trunks grown inward like clasped hands, bark ridged, resin beads shining like trapped stars. Shadow paused at that living gate, looked back and waited for assent. Elias lifted the lantern so the flame showed his face. Agreement crossed in a knot. They passed through. The air beyond felt different, quieter even than the hush that follows heavy weather, quiet the way a chapel is quiet before a bell. Mud changed to firm loam. Fern gave way to short grass pressed flat by recent wind. On the near side of a rock the size of a truck tire lay a plait of reeds, pinned beneath a smooth stone, wet and newly set. Elias felt the hair lift along his forearms because the arrangement carried intent. Shadow stepped to the lip of a small overlook where the land fell away to a bowl silvered by residual rain. The beast stood tall and motionless, then touched his knee with a deliberate brush of flank, a contact brief as a handshake, meaning crossed without flourish. Courage had been requested, courage had been delivered, more would be asked. If you have ever answered a pull you could not explain, and only afterward understood why it was the right answer, keep that memory open. Shadow tipped its head toward a darker path skirting the bowl, then back to him, waiting not as a test but as a courtesy. Elias turned down the lantern until the mantle glowed small and sure, gave one breath to steady everything inside, and nodded again. They went on, the circle of light moving ahead like a quiet boat on black water, the night drawing in behind as if a curtain had closed to keep the rest of the world from seeing what came next. He kept going without looking back once, breathing. Rain slackened to a thready mist as the great dog lay where Elias had pulled it free, ribs shuddering under a mud-plastered coat while breath scraped in harsh, shallow runs that fogged the cooling air. He stayed a measured distance at first, palms open, axe sheathed, rope coiled beside his boot, the old discipline settling into his bones like a familiar weight. Instinct warned that teeth and terror could still flash without signal after a struggle like that. Yet nothing in the animal's posture promised violence, it simply existed on the edge of collapse, head low, eyes steady, tracking him with a focus that felt almost formal. Rain clicked from needles, slowed and then paused as the cloud deck thinned to pale gauze. The forest held its breath. Elias listened with the care he once reserved for rooms about to flash over, hearing only the quiet metronome of panting, the soft tick of cooling rope hardware, and the distant thread of water sliding over shale. He knelt, not close, just enough that they shared a line of sight without threat, and let his hands rest on his thighs, shoulders eased, chest open, making himself small in every way that mattered. The gaze he met was not wild, it was present, lucid, older than fear, carrying a question he could not parse but could honor. Recognition or something neighboring it moved through him with a heat that surprised him, like finding a live ember under ash hours after the last flame. 2 wars and a lifetime of fires had taught him that living things under pressure read bodies better than words, so he kept the scene simple, stillness, breath, and patience. The dog blinked once, not a flinch, more a slow shudder, then let its jaw settle on clay and closed its mouth around a sound that might have been pain or relief. Steam rose from its hide in faint strands. A tremor traveled along the flank, then Elias glanced at the sky, judged the window before the weather regrouped, and made a choice that felt less like a decision than an acknowledgement of a road he had stepped onto the moment he tied the first knot. He shrugged off his pack, set it on a dry fern mat and took out a small steel bottle, a folded tarp, tinder, a striker and a waxed pouch that lived there for moments without guarantees. He unfolded the tarp, shook rain from creases, and spread it near a dent in the ground where runoff had failed to settle. The act invited the dog to move without demanding it. Nothing shifted, only the eyes followed, measuring each motion with dignified concentration. He poured water into a shallow lid, slid it a handspan closer and waited. The tongue appeared, pink under stained foam barely lifting, then retreated as if the body refused to trust its own reach. Elias nudged the lid another inch and backed away again until space felt breathable for both of them. Time went soft around the edges. An alder leaf drifted down, touched the dog's shoulder and clung there like a medal until a slow breath lifted it free. Elias remembered a night in a city far from pines when he and a partner crawled under a beam while floors above them argued about staying upright, how he had spoken to a stranger trapped under an iron bed, kept his tone level, described the next minutes as if reading from a manual written by Mercy, how the stranger's eyes, ringed by soot, had locked onto his and held, not pleading, not raging, just insisting that witness mattered. That same insistence lived here now, transposed to a torn, exhausted creature on damp soil, and he felt it like a thread running through the years, binding unalike moments into a single vow. He struck the rod, caught a spark on the fiber, breathed until the ember became flame, then stacked pencil wood, then finger wood, building heat without smoke so the air stayed kind. The smell of resin and damp bark turned the clearing from clinic to hearth. With the fire working, he tore a heel of bread into thumb pieces, set them on the tarp, then shaved a strip of jerky into narrow curls that would not choke a tired throat. He spoke no command, offered no kiss or whistle, only quiet breath and shake. The dog lifted its head a fraction, eyes narrowing as if that flame lived inside memory. Muscles along the jaw flexed, a paw twitched. Elias waited. When nothing more came, he pushed one bread piece along the tarp with 2 fingers until it sat midway between them. Minutes passed, not empty, simply full of attention. At last the animal extended its tongue, touched the bread, drew it back, then tried again, this time catching the softened crumb and holding it against the palate long enough to swallow. Elias felt a flood of something. The shadow guided Elias along the wet rim into a corridor where cedar and fir leaned like ribs, their bead-bright needles whispering as breeze sifted through. The lantern's mantle glowed small and disciplined, cutting a quiet oval from the dark. Mud hushed beneath their steps. Ahead the ridge curved and released them into a shallow bowl, a natural room rimmed by spruce and hemlock, rain polished and faintly luminous. In its center lay a ring of stones cupping a smoldering bed of coals, not flame enough to boast, only breath enough to live. Silvered grass pressed flat around the circle as if bodies had lain there and risen recently. The air held a resin sweetness braided with mineral. Elias stopped where grass gave way to damp earth, printed by heavy pads, and lowered the lantern so its light spilled across his boots instead of his face. Weight of attention fell like a net. Shapes resolved from the gloom, 5, perhaps 6, massive canine forms arrayed just beyond the stones, each distinct, one broad and brindled with a seamed muzzle, one narrow-hipped with a white blaze bright as chalk, another compact and dark with eyes like chips of old amber. They did not rush or scatter, they watched. Shadow halted between Elias and the ring, tail steady, ears forward, neck high, making no display beyond presence. The brindled elder stepped a pace and raised a paw, holding it mid-air, a quiet line drawn by posture alone. The white-blazed sentinel flowed sideways to shade a flank and taste his scent without crowding. A younger one leaned forward until breath fogged the light, then settled back with its chin on paws, neither fearful nor bold, merely alert. Elias matched the room's restraint. He did not reach for the axe, he let the axe remain what it was, a tool not a story. He eased his jaw, counted one breath, then another, and answered the question no throat had voiced by stopping where the attention tightened. Shadow gave 3 soft pulses, report not warning. The elder's paw lowered, shoulders along the ring softened a fraction. Elias knelt, set the lantern on the soil and opened his hands. Light grazed stone, grass and steam. The coals brightened, then sank, as if listening. Up close differences sharpened. One ear had torn and healed to a ragged pennant. Another wore a ladder of old scars across the flank like a river seen from height. The smallest studied him with a fierce, honest curiosity, yet every gaze shared the same lucid calm that had unsettled him when he first reached the pit. Awareness without panic, calculation without malice. Shadow looked from Elias to the ring as if reminding him that the fire did not belong to his hands tonight. The elder drifted to the nearest stone, pressed a paw to its rim, and issued a long, even tone. Shadow answered with 2 shorter pulses. Meaning sat just beyond articulation, yet remained plain. Honor the boundary, approach with care, acknowledge the Elias mirrored that respect by backing half a step and sitting on his heels. Thighs hummed from the hike, palms smelled of fuel and wet rope. Rain had burnished the hollow. Every blade glittered, stones wore a sheen that turned contour into script. The embers breathed and settled. No birds called. Silence held, full rather than empty, like the hush after a saved stranger draws a first clear breath. Shadow placed a twig at the circle's edge and withdrew. The sentinel added a thin flake of bark. The elder hummed, then angled its muzzle toward Elias as if to include him. He reached slow as weather into a pocket, drew a folded scrap of waxed paper and lifted a piece of jerky he had saved. He did not break the ring. He extended the food along the outer arm. Shadow accepted with deliberate care, chewed without haste, then laid the empty paper flat as if returning a token. A faint pulse followed, an almost musical acknowledgement that brushed Elias's stern discipline with wonder without asking him to abandon reason. He understood the grammar, if not the language. These were not beasts convened by accident. They were a family gathered under rules older than any story pinned to a counter in town. He counted again 5 visible, and perhaps one more in the thick of trunks. But he did not strain to prove it. Witness mattered more than inventory. The elder's eyes held him, not to dominate, only to measure whether he could carry a shared space without breaking it. He kept his gaze level, shoulders low, hands. Shadow edged close and let flank touch knee. A brief contact with meaning packed tight inside. Gratitude, claim, caution. The elder dipped its head, a motion so small and definite it could not be misread. Elias answered with a nod. From the timber, a soft note floated back, distant, resonant. Another voice acknowledging the compact. The ring relaxed by degrees. The youngest lay sphinx-like. The scarred veteran curled its tail against a hind leg. The sentinel faced the trails, and worked the wind with minute adjustments of ears and nose. Shadow sat with him, neither above nor below him, exactly beside. Elias thought of Maggie Holt's drawer of plaster casts, of hunters who spoke of tall dusk shapes, of jokes woven to dismiss fear. He had stacked those things on a shelf marked stories, and left them there, because the world already held enough work. Now the shelf had cracked. The unknown was not monstrous. It was mindful. He had pulled one life from mud and found a beyond it waited a household that guarded itself with restraint rather than threat. If you have ever stepped into a room that reordered what you believed, a lab at night, a chapel at dawn, a hospital hall after an impossible recovery, remember how air changed, and sound grew gentle. How a private rule melted and a larger understanding took its place. Hold that memory beside this clearing and let it widen your path. The elder rose, circled the coals, and paused with muzzle pointed toward a notch in the trees where water murmured. Shadow glanced at Elias and then at that notch, asking without pressure. Go now, return when called. Keep the place unspoken, protect by leaving unnamed. Elias lifted the lantern and let the light fall sideways so it would not challenge the ring. He stood, joints protesting in quiet grateful aches, nodded to Shadow, then to the elder, then to each watcher who had granted him this seat at the edge of their fire. He stepped away like a craftsman retreating from a bench where delicate work continues after hands withdraw. At the rim, he looked back once and saw silvered grass, stone and watchful silhouettes cut from moon and mist. Then the trees blocked the view. The forest accepted him without commentary. Drip faded to trickle and now was not triumph, and not pity, only relief stitched to respect. He guided water closer with the back of a knuckle until the lid bumped the chin. The tongue found the rim, and drank in tiny, hesitant licks that became steadier with each pass. After several sips the head lowered and rested again. Rain thinned to freckles, then stopped entirely, leaving light suspended between trunks, pale, clean, new. The fire whispered. Ravens passed as shadows above the canopy, uninterested judging. Elias warmed his hands and let heat crawl up into wrists and forearms where cold had set anchor during the pull. The dog watched the hands rather than the flame, studying the slow opening and closing as if cataloging each joint. Something in that focus unsettled him, not in a way that warned, but in a way that suggested language. He set another bread piece down, then a sliver of jerky. The meat drew attention, a nostril flared, the head moved an inch. The tongue gathered the offering with care, held, swallowed, rested. Elias measured the breath now, still rough, less desperate, pacing itself. He felt the way a stalled heart sometimes remembers its duty when given oxygen and time. His own chest,
long used to the harness of effort, loose. The rope, rinsed by rain, glowed faintly where light reached it. He coiled it by habit because order nested inside care. Steam ebbed from the coat, clots of mud cracked and fell away, revealing coarse guard hairs the color of winter river scars crossed the shoulder in pale lines under the grime, some old, some recent. A broken claw showed on the left forefoot. The sheer scale astonished him. Next to the firelight, the head looked almost wolfen, yet the eyes held none of a wolf's glassy indifference. They held an appraisal. He realized he had been waiting for a snap, a warning, a reversion to a rule he understood, because behavior that fit a box could be managed. Instead he found a presence that met him halfway, and asked him to step farther. That ask tugged at places he had sealed. Memory opened anyway. If a moment like this has ever found you, remember the hush, the choice to stay, and the warmth you offered without asking anything back.
Dawn found Elias crossing the last ridge with the lantern cold and his boots lighter than when he left. The forest felt rearranged, not louder, only more awake, as if new eyes had opened inside bark and stone. The cabin accepted him with its small complaints, boards breathing, hinges muttering, stove metal ticking as it cooled. He hung the lantern, peeled off the wet coat and set the rope to dry on the pegs. Steam lifted from wool in pale skeins. He washed mud from his hands until the water ran clear, then stood at the sink and let the window frame the trees while breath evened. A person might have called what he felt relief or awe, or fatigue in a clean shirt. He did not tag it. He poured coffee, opened his notebook, dated the page in a hand that had learned steadiness from duty, and began to write exactly what had happened. He described the bowl, a ring of stones holding coals like a slow heart, grass silvered by rain, spruce forming a vaulted hush, water murmuring through a notch. He described the pact by observation rather than myth. He kept the language plain because plainness refuses theater and invites accuracy. Number observed, 5 in clear view. A 6th implied in cover, distinguishing marks. Brindled elder with healed muzzle seam, narrow sentinel with white blaze, compact dark adult carrying old flank scars, one younger with high curiosity, shadow bearing fresh claw damage on the left forefoot and older lines along the shoulder. Behavior coordinated, restrained, ritual around coals, deliberate pulses used for signaling. Proximity management, precise, courteous reaction to human approach. Tense acceptance shaped by shadows mediation. Fire handling, not ignition but stewardship. Embers kept, not stoked to flame. He printed each conclusion on its own line, then returned to add conditions beneath. Inference, not proof. Pattern, not certainty. He noted the twig shadow placed and the flake of bark the sentinel added, then drew a small plan of where each body had settled in relation to wind, water and exit. In the margin he wrote a rule older than any he had linked to ladders or hose. If you learn a door exists, do not force it, wait until it is open to you. He closed the notebook and slid it behind the map stack under the old radio with the dead speaker, a place no visitor would think to check. Secrecy was not selfishness, it was protection, theirs from curiosity, his from the appetite for proof that ruins fragile things. He brewed more coffee and stood on the porch with the cup wrapped in both hands while the clearing rinsed itself under a faint sun. Each familiar outline wore a new edge. Even the dent in the top step where his boot habitually landed looked different, as if it now represented a decision rather than an accident. Solitude had been his chosen shape, a discipline that kept noise outside and intention inside. After the bowl, solitude felt like a responsibility instead, a form that could carry trust without spilling it. He realized the night's work had not contradicted his years of living apart, it had refined them. Connection did not require chat, it required careful attention and was offered without price. He spent the morning with chores that keep wonder from fermenting into fantasy. He split rounds to a clean face, wiped the axe, scrubbed the rope, checked the carabiner gate, tightened a loose hinge and swept grit from the threshold. Between tasks he returned to the notebook to add small exact things he had forgotten in the first pass. The way shadow touched his knee before the ring. Brief as a handshake, the elder's head dip that read like permission. The sentinel's habit of facing trails even while resting. The youngest chin on pause, the careful beating of resin on the nearest fur. He included a line about sound because sound had been the first boundary to change. In the clearing, voices had been pulses, patience and placement rather than vocabulary. He wrote, intelligence can be felt before it is measured. Toward noon he walked the property. By the seep below the firs he found reeds plaited and pinned with a flat stone. It might have been children, though none had passed here in months. It might have been wind, though wind does not tie. He replaced the stone exactly and stepped back until his prints ended, then let Rain's memory erase the rest. Back at the cabin he sharpened the axe though it did not need it, warmed stew and ate standing at the counter because hunger lives close to the surface after a night that rearranges your interior furniture. When evening fell he set a second chair on the porch for the first time since he moved in, not as a summons but as an acknowledgement. He brought out the thermos and a cup and left both under the rail where a visitor could reach without crossing a line. He did not whistle, call or tap. He sat with his blanket, breathed cedar and damp wood, and listened. The forest's tone had shifted by a shade only someone tuned to it would hear, like the change in air just before a stairwell flash. He heard drip thinning to tick, tick fading to hush, hush opening to vole scratch and the soft wing of an owl. Above that lay the faintest pattern, a counting that did not pretend to be language yet shaped itself like one. Once nearer than before a reply rose from the draw, a pulse that folded the night tighter around the porch. He left the cup and a strip of jerky on the step and withdrew. By morning the cup held only a ring, and the strip was gone, the boards unsmudged, proof edited by courtesy. He considered calling Nathan Cole to trade talk about pumps, culverts and salt blocks, because ordinary conversation bleeds pressure, but the urge passed. Some things rot under casual tongues. He wrote a third entry instead, a page labeled He listed choices: no photographs, no lures, no tracks cast without invitation, no travel to the bowl except by Shadow's lead, no disclosure until he understood the cost. He wrote that he would give up proof to keep faith. He wrote that secrecy, kept for dignity, is different from secrecy used to hoard power. The week found a rhythm. Each night he sat on the porch through the first, dark, slept, then woke at the hour when the house and the hills feel most alike and watched clouds begin to rain without wind. He kept the lantern oiled, rope coiled and axe clean. He kept his body honest with farm work in the morning, and the steadiness of drills that had once saved his life. He kept his attention trained so that the quiet could speak clearly. The world outside the timber kept turning, trucks on the highway, gunmetal weather on distant wheat, mail that could wait. Inside the timber a different clock ticked. On the seventh evening, a shape paused at the trees tall and whole. Eyes caught the porch light and held it like small moon. Elias did not stand. He nodded once. Shadow answered with a single pulse and the smallest tilt toward the woods, not a command, a reminder. Elias set a fresh cup on the rail, stepped back and watched the dark take the shape apart and carry it away without sound. By the end of the week his notes filled several pages. He mapped the route to the bowl but left the final turn unmarked, a deliberate gap because some knowledge must be earned each time. He wrote that the absence of photographs did not shrink the truth. He wrote that the pack's restraint demanded the same from him. He wrote a sentence that surprised him with its softness: I am not alone, and that does not cancel solitude, it changes its purpose. He placed the notebook in the tin, set the tin beneath the dead radio, and weighted it with a river stone he had carried home years ago, because it looked like a heart that had chosen work over display. The experience did not solve anything, it granted he would hold a trust without turning it into a trophy. He would let wonder teach him patience. He would keep a chair ready. Have you ever met something or someone that redefined your world? Share below. Tell the moment you trusted your gut despite fear. What changed afterward? Elias keeps a chair on the porch and a cup by the rail, listening for a soft pulse in the rain. Maybe tonight Shadow returns, again quiet.